on the wines of Corsica. And the fun thing about these wines is they're actually all through the importer Kermit Lynch. So you might have noticed, for those of you who had the February CruBox, it was focused on the wines from the wine importer Rosenthal. But for this month, we're focused on Kermit Lynch, another wine importer, really well known for his French wine selections, and also focused on a lot of family-owned smaller domains with a lot of times organic farming and just really high quality production, but smaller production overall. And Kermit Lynch's company actually is based out of Berkeley, California, and he does have some really great properties in Italy as well. But actually, I think one of the areas that he really focuses on, which is not an area that gets a lot of love, is Corsica. And I've always found Corsican wines to be so intriguing because not only is it an island that's technically French, but it has a lot of Italian influence. And you have there a lot of these indigenous grape varietals, and then a lot of varietals too that we're a little bit more familiar with. So we can kind of break that down throughout this experience together. But I thought it might be helpful kind of just to get started, to give you a quick little walkthrough in terms of like what you can expect in terms of the regions of Corsica. We're going to explore 3 different wineries tonight in 3 different kind of distinctive areas, but there are actually 9 subregions within Corsica. So you have, if you look on your insert, you'll see a map of Corsica, and you'll see that at the top where it says B, which is our second wine, the Bleccia, that's an area which is actually kind of like the highest quality production region within Corsica, which is called Patrimonio. It definitely makes some of the most serious wines of Corsica that tend to be based off of one of the main grapes that you'll find there for white wine production, Vermentino, also known as Vermentino in Italy, and Rolle in southern France. And we'll talk about that all tonight. And then another grape varietal called Mieluccio, which is also known as Sangiovese in Tuscany for a red grape. So very serious area of production, beautiful kind of hillside vineyards, and definitely the kind of top region in terms of some of the more expensive wines coming from Corsica. And then you'll see, if we're going towards the west, we have the region of Corse Calvi, which is going to be where Domaine Mastracci comes from, which we'll talk about tonight. And a lot of top producers are coming from that area too. So that's kind of right in that northwestern corner. And then as we work our way down to kind of the central western side of Corsica, you have the third most kind of prominent region, which is Ajaccio, which is actually the birthplace of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most famous residents of Corsica, and definitely some really great producers and some of the original kind of top producers coming from that region. And then south, you have Sartone and then Figari. Those are going to be both kind of at the bottom tip of the island. Kind of harder to find wines in the US from those 2 areas, but they make some really, really beautiful selections. So afterwards, I'm happy to kind of point you in the direction of some really other cool producers that you can get into. And then we have 2 in the kind of southeastern corner of the island, Porto Vecchio, smaller area, some really interesting wines. There are a lot of wines that don't actually make it outside of Corsica that remain there. And then you'll have, where you see the C on your map, that's a larger general area, which is called Vin de Corse, which is this long area which goes kind of all throughout the eastern side of the island. And there's actually not a ton of producers there, but definitely a lot of really interesting quality wines. And we'll dive into Marchigliani tonight. And then if we round back up at the top, close to where Patrimonio is, but in that kind of tip, you'll see like a little peninsula that juts out. There's actually a region there called Muscat de Cap Corse, which makes a very famous dessert wine from the area. Also very difficult to find in the US. So we'll have some challenges tonight in terms of some of the availability of some of these products, because there really are so many great wines of Corsica, but you just don't always see a ton of stuff available in Massachusetts. So for anybody tuning in from outside of Massachusetts, we can talk about availability elsewhere as well. But let's dive into it together. Let's first just quickly go over the 3 main grape varietals that we're going to go over tonight. because Corsica, about probably 1/3 or so of the plantings in Corsica are going to be Vermentino, also known as Vermentino, a white grape varietal, which has origins in Italy, but also planted in southern France. And then we'll dive into the two most widely planted red grape varietals, which are Chacarello. These spellings look a little wacky. I tried to phonetically spell them out for you, which is a lighter red varietal. It's interesting. It has thick skins, but it also makes light colored wines that tend to have high acidity, a lot of times used for blending in red wines, or a lot of times used for rosé wine production. And the wines tend to be a little bit more herbaceous and red fruit focused. And then you'll have Mieluccio, which is going to be, once again, known as Sangiovese, one of the most prominently planted red grape varietals and one of the highest caliber, which tends to make wines that are more robust, a little more tannic, a little more gamey, and a little bit more kind of powerful. So who's ready to dive in? Are you excited? Let's do it. Cool. I'll start us with our first wine. We're starting up in the region A, which is with 2019 Domaine Mastrace I Prove, which is going to be 100% Vermentino, which is coming from Corsica, Calvi, which is going to be right in that northwestern corner. So, but Domaine Mastrace was started by a gentleman named Roger Mastrace in around 1945. And he actually had come originally from Northern Africa. He had taken over an old olive oil mill, which he repurposed into a winery and kind of got the process started of planting grape varietals. What's really interesting I found about Corsican wine is while they've been planting grapes there for such a long period of time, the revival of the wine industry in terms of commercial production really started taking place in the 50s and 60s. And you found, and we'll kind of dive into this a little bit tonight, that a lot of these kind of old school wineries that started around like the 1950s, you have the second and third generations taking over production, and it's kind of making some of these older school wineries a little bit more fresh, and they're reviving them by a lot of times working with these old school indigenous grape varietals. So there's a lot of really cool stuff going on. So Roger Mastrace ended up passing his winery down to his son, who ended up now passing the winery down to his daughter, Camille Anais Reust. So female winemaker here. We're gonna get into a couple of female winemakers tonight, which is really cool. And Épreuve is the line of their kind of entry-level wines that they do. They do an Épreuve for a white, or blanc, a rosé, and then a rouge as well. And this is, I think, a really great introduction to 100% Vermentino from Corsica. What's really interesting about the Vermentino grape is that it is known for having typically like high phenolic bitterness. So sometimes you can get in this grape a little bit of this like hint of like bitter almond that comes through, which is really interesting and really refreshing. And it is one of the few grapes too that can really tolerate warm climates. So it's planted in Sardinia, just to the south, where it's actually probably one of the most famous regions for Vermentino grapes. You have it planted in the Tuscan coast. You have it planted in Provence and southeastern France, where it's known as Rolle, spelled L-R-O-L-L-E. And then you have grape varietals, which are kind of, some people think they're 100% related, other people not so much. So I never like to say definitives, but there's a grape called Pagato, which is grown in Liguria, which is known to be related. And then also a grape called Favorita in Piedmont, which is thought to be related as well. So what we have here is 100% Vermentino that's aged in stainless steel. The interesting thing about actually all of the wines we're tasting tonight is there are no oak on any of these 4 wines, which I think is kind of cool because we're letting the grape's natural personality shine through and seeing them for what they are. And what I think a lot of winemakers would say about Corsican wine is you have that Mediterranean influence in terms of that beautiful sunshine, but at the same time, you have a really refined and like mineral driven, fresh quality to the wines. Because while yes, Corsica is warm, there's a lot of like moderating influences. There's a lot of high elevation and a lot of really beautiful soils that can create real balance in the wines that you don't always see in more Mediterranean climates. So I think this is the perfect example of that balance. This for me is a Vermentino that's incredibly bright, fresh and a little leaner than some of the other Vermentino wines that I've had, especially those in Sardinia, which can get pretty bold, and even some of those from the Tuscan coast. So when I'm kind of sniffing through this and tasting it, something that comes to mind is just this kind of a little touch of this like briny citrus characteristic that comes through up front. And just this beautiful laser-like acidity and minerality on the palate. It's just an incredibly fresh Vermentino. And just one of those wines that, once again, as we have the warmer weather coming, which is very exciting, that you could do with so many different things throughout the summer. A great kind of wine to start off the evening. Also something great to do with shellfish. And I actually had put in a pairing too. I found some like traditional Corsican recipes. So I found this Corsican bean soup that I thought it would be actually nice with, because it could just cut through the richness of that dish and give it like a really refreshing characteristic. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on this wine if you've gotten to enjoy it, and just any questions that you might have so far. Anyone? No worries if not. I can keep on talking, but I always want to let it be as interactive as possible for everybody.
So just to give some feedback. So I've tried these wines for the last couple of days, and then again today. So this one had a very interesting aroma to me. On the nose, it was very citrus, and I was really looking forward to, oh wow, what's this one going to taste like? And it really finished with like all sorts of different flowers for me, right? All sorts of different flowers, which isn't always my favorite, you know what I mean? So, but then again, tonight, I don't know if it's the presentation or what, but just being on the webcam here tonight, I'm like kind of tasting different things now, you know what I mean? And I'm kind of enjoying this a little more. So, so I just thought that was interesting in terms of the aromas of citrus, and then it was really finishing with a bouquet of maybe white flowers, if you could ever do
definitely.
that, you know?
Yeah, sometimes you can find that Vermentino can give you like a hint of those like white floral characteristics, but typically the like kind of bitter almond, sometimes subtle white flowers, sometimes lemon lime, and sometimes too I can get some like stone fruit characteristics like peach apricot, depending on like if it's a warmer kind of richer interpretation. But it's a beautiful wine. Sometimes some like subtle like herbaceous qualities too that can come through, especially from those like bitter notes. But Vermentino is such an interesting grape, and Vermentino, once again with the U at the end, is going to be the traditional Corsican spelling. You'll see that Corsica will have very unique spellings for all their grape varietals. And sometimes, especially since I do so many Italian events, I'm so used to saying the Italian pronunciation, Vermentino with the O at the end. But I should, since it's Corsica, be saying Vermentino, which is going to be their typical pronunciation. But I'm glad, thank you so much, Jim, for like sharing that feedback. It is so interesting to see how these wines change too, like as you have them over the next couple of days. The interesting thing about also the wines that we're tasting tonight is these wines tonight, like while we've definitely had some wines in CruBox that have aging potential, none of these wines I'd say are meant to age. They're not like, I mean, they'll be totally fine within a couple of years, and they're really well made, high quality wines. But at the same time, like these wines are kind of all about the youthfulness and freshness. And that's kind of what makes them special. So I think that if you kind of wanted to set them aside for 5 or 10 years, would they be horrible? By no means, but like, I don't think they give you anything more. And I think that that's kind of like what's fun about this is it's just the purity and like the expression of place, but done in a little bit more of a youthful, like fun expression. If that makes sense.
I have like a rudimentary question, and excuse me for this, but how do you think about aging with white versus red wine? That's just something I've never really understood. I tend to think of aging as being a really important thing with red wine, but I've never really thought about it with white. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there definitely are white wines that are meant for aging. It's a small percentage of like, the amount of white wines that are out there. It's a very small percentage, but typically the things that white wine will need to be age worthy will be naturally the grape varietal has to have higher levels of acidity. So that's really important. So you'll find that some of the grape varietals that tend to be able to go the distance are grape varietals such as like Riesling from Germany, super high acid grapes, Chenin Blanc from the Loire Valley, certain Chardonnays. And then in Italy, for example, one of my favorites is, which we've explored before, is Timorasso from Piedmont. But there's a lot of them out there, but it's still like not only high acidity, which is important, but a lot of times you'll find that some of the white wine expressions that are meant for aging will be aged in either oak barrels, or sometimes they'll also use like concrete as like a way to kind of produce freshness. But the oak barrels will actually help add like a little tannin to the wine, because like white wine lacks tannin because you're not typically using the skins in production, and that's where you'll find the majority of your tannin. And tannin helps the wine perpetuate its life. It's kind of like a preservative in that sense. And over time, tannin fades and drops out, so it's an important component. So it's about like the quality of the grape, the special sense of place, and the aging regimen that producer chooses. So because of that, there's a very small percentage of white wines that can go the distance. And when I say go the distance, like, go like 5, 10-ish years. And then there's a small percentage that can go for much longer than that. But aged white wines can be just a really lovely experience. One of my favorites will always be like aged champagne, because that's a very happy place for me. But it's really challenging to know exactly like what a wine's trajectory is going to be in its life, whether it's a white wine or a red wine. And so the clues that I like to use to like help are, first of all, always consult the producer if I have access to them, because I think that they always know their wines more than any of us ever can from their experience. But I also like to look at the grapes that are used, the methods of aging, and where the wine's coming from. And that'll help me get a little bit more of a better understanding of the aging potential of that wine.
Thanks.
Of course. Yeah, it's definitely like confusing, because the amount of wines that are actually made out there for like immediate consumption is around, I want to say at least 90% of wine production in the world is meant for immediate consumption. Now it'll like maybe 3 years, but like I'd say 2 is probably safer. So there is a really small percentage of wines, made in the world that have longevity. And it's an interesting conversation. And there's a lot of wine experts that like will tell you they know the trajectory of everything. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes I'm sure they're not. It's a challenging thing to do.
One of the things I find really interesting about this particular set of wines, and that I find exciting about this program in general, is the wines that are made from grapes that you don't typically see.
Yeah.
I find that particularly exciting and kind of fun. Do any of these grapes in these Corsican wines, some of the like the Vermentino and the other two, are they grown outside of Corsica and used in wines elsewhere, or is it pretty much exclusive?
What's interesting is, so there's over 40 indigenous grape varietals to Corsica. So there's tons of grapes that we're not going to be able to explore today. But as I mentioned, like Vermentino is actually like, it is planted outside of Corsica. It's like planted in the coast of Tuscany. Sardinia would be like the two kind of most traditional areas in Italy. You do find it, once again, known as like Favorita in Piedmont, and then known as Pagato in Liguria in Italy. And then it's planted in southern France, most of the time in Provence and southeastern France, where it's the synonym for Vermentino is a roll. So Vermentino is one that is definitely kind of planted elsewhere. The Ceccarello, that like lighter red grape, is known as Momolo in Italy. You probably never had a Momolo before. I have not ever had 100% Momolo, but it's known for being planted in Tuscany. And it's actually known as being a blending varietal, like kind of classic old school blending varietal for some of the Chianti red wines of Tuscany. So you'll find that there, but not to my knowledge planted elsewhere. And then the Nulluccio is planted in Tuscany as Sangiovese. That's its closest relative. There are minute differences now between both grapes, just since Neluccio has been in Corsica for so long, and it takes on some of its own characteristics. But Sangiovese is one of Italy's most famous grapes, and definitely Tuscany is kind of its heartland, though you'll find it elsewhere too. That's helpful. But there are definitely grape varietals that you'll find throughout Corsica. Like, we'll explore one tonight called Bianco Gentile, which will be in our second wine, Vlecchia, that really are not planted elsewhere. And it's so interesting because there are so many indigenous grape varietals out there. And with CruBox, that was one of the things that I really wanted to get people excited about, because there's so much great quality wine. And sometimes if you can't like understand what it is from like looking at the label, it's just people aren't going to go out and purchase it, right? So it's fun to get to explore, for sure. Any other questions before I move on to the Vlecchia, to our second wine? We'll do it. Awesome. Okay. So I'll also just make a quick note too that a lot of the wines that we're exploring tonight are not only really high quality farming. So Mastracci, I think, converted to biodynamic, their biodynamic certification. So that's taking, once again, organic farming a step further and a more holistic approach. But it's also pretty small production here too, 10,000 cases annually produced in total. So a lot of these wines are pretty small production. We'll actually keep on getting smaller and smaller as we work our way down. So our second wine is going to be the 2019 Vlecchia Blanc, which is under the kind of designation on the back. You'll see it's Ile de Beauté, which means island of beauty. And that is actually kind of the largest designation. We talked about those kind of 9 subregions of Corsica. Ile de Beauté is kind of like the entry level classification for Corsican wines. It just gives producers a little more flexibility from where they can source the grapes from and aging requirements, and it just gives them a little more flexibility. Vlecchia is actually based in Patrimonio, so it's that northern region, which is the B on your map. And they do make these beautiful wines that are indicated by the designation of Patrimonio. They make a Patrimonio Blanc, Rosé, and red, which all come from older vines, and they all go through a process of longer term aging before release. And the whites and definitely the reds have some more aging potential, and the rosé wines are just wonderful. But the Ile de Beauté kind of classification allows for Vlecchia to make some more kind of fresher, approachable style wines too, which are typically coming from younger vines overall. So the vines, while as the Mastracci was being sourced from 25-year-old vines, the Vlecchia is sourcing their fruit from about 15-year-old vines, so a little bit younger. So you get a little bit more kind of playful fruit here. And this is interesting because it's 70% Vermentino, but with 30% Bianco Gentile. So that's one of those indigenous grapes that you really do not see elsewhere. And Vlecchia, the producer, was actually one of the few to kind of help revive this grape that was also almost extinct. And they brought it back. And while we don't get it, I don't think, into Massachusetts, or I haven't even seen it available in the US, they actually do make an 100% Bianco Gentile, which they're known for. And it's really interesting to sometimes see what some of these grape varietals are like on their own, because sometimes it's hard to kind of understand what their personalities are like when you just see them in a blend. But they're there for a reason, right? So what I found just so interesting about the Vlecchia Ile de Beauté Blanc in comparison to the Mastracci is this is a little bit more north. We're going to find, in terms of the soil, schist, limestone, and clay, whereas the Mastracci was coming from clay, sand, and granite. And once again, you have a blend here. And I find that this wine just has so much more texture and a lot more richness than the Mastracci, which is interesting because they're both predominantly the same grape, both same vintage, and not super far away from one another. So I thought that was interesting. And this is also, once again, another wine. There's no oak aging here. The interesting thing about Vlecchia's wines is Lecchia, like his name translates to oak, but like he never uses any oak in his wines. So it's just an interesting thing. And he's definitely known as kind of one of the producers from Corsica that makes, in my opinion, some of the most refined and beautiful wines. In terms of the aromatics, the balance, the just delicate fruit, they just make me so incredibly happy. So this is aged for 6 months. You get like a little bit more of like an oilier characteristic, a little bit more viscosity here. And with the Bianco Gentile, that's known for giving the wine a little bit more power and sometimes some hints of tropical fruit. So taste it. We still have the acidity here, but which is a really nice, actually, more lingering finish, but the texture here is just so much more robust. I don't know if anybody got to kind of taste the two wines side by side or compare them yet, but I was just incredibly kind of taken aback by how different these two wines are in terms of texture from one to the other. I also am a huge fan of Yves Leccia's rosé wines. His Il de Beauté rosé, which does come into the market, is so good. For those rosé lovers here, Corsica actually makes some incredible rosés that are really fresh and beautiful and vibrant. They're a little more complex, and they're not sometimes as intense as some Provençal rosés can be in terms of the fruit. It's a little bit more, they're a little more bright, and they're usually a little lighter in color. They can be just wonderful. But I'm such a huge fan of the wines that Yves Leccia makes. And in terms of production here, we're at 5,000 cases annually. So production levels are going down, small production, organic farming, and just like, in my opinion, one of my favorite producers. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if anybody got to taste this wine and any feedback. Well, I can just start talking again, because I honestly, what I love about like what Kermit Lynch has done in terms of kind of putting together some of these producers is it really kind of runs the gamut in terms of like locations all around Corsica. But you'll definitely see, we're not, of course, focusing tonight on like a wine that is within the Patrimonio designation. This is the closest that we'll get. But if you are interested in kind of understanding the like creme de la creme of Corsican wines, the wines that have the Patrimonio designation on them for the AOC are just really interesting, especially too for the red wine drinkers here, the Nielucciu that they're using, which is Sangiovese, is the kind of heart of the wines. It's typically a blend. And they're just really interesting, complex. They're, for those of you who like an earthier, kind of more rustic style, they're a little bit more reminiscent of like the Rhone Valley, but like fresher, if that makes sense. And they're just a wonderful experience. And they're not crazy expensive. Like usually I'd say like the top end is typically in the maybe 60-ish range. And that's like, you know, working your way up there. You can find some really interesting, like age-worthy wine in like that 30 to 50 range, which is great. I mean, I think that's where like when you're kind of exploring some of these other regions of the world, it's amazing, like just the value that you can find just once you kind of go to somewhere that's a little bit more obscure. Did anybody like feel like this tasted very different to them from the Mastracci if you had gotten to try them both? Yeah. Did you have a preference of one or the other, or like them both? Anyone? Well, I like them both. But
Well, I'll try, but I just finished it and I wish I could. I'm so terrible. My wine memory is so bad, right? I wish I had some more in the glass here. I think that I initially thought I enjoyed the first wine over the second wine, because the second wine, the YL, had a little bit of it was a little more viscous, and it
yeah,
was this is me recalling my wine brain here, even though I just drank these. Almost viscous in terms of like almost like a little bit more Chardonnay
yeah,
type. You know what I mean? Where the first one was a little lighter, I was thinking about pairing it. I was thinking
yeah,
about, sitting out in the sunshine and drinking it. And the second one had a little bit more body to it, and it had a little bit of an aftertaste Then again, the first one was bitter, like you said. That was the first thing that hit me when I first tasted it a couple days ago. I said, okay, that has a bitter aftertaste to it. So between the two, I think maybe after tasting it a few times, maybe the first one I would say
Yeah.
would be more something I'd want to have on an 80-degree day, eating
Yeah.
some salty fish or something like that.
For sure. It's so interesting because like I think that they just both kind of showcase a different expression of Vermentino and showing like what it can be like when it's blended with something else. And I think it's just interesting because there's just like a laser like focus to the Mastracci, the first wine. Then the Uvlecchia just has this beautiful texture, which is just like a little more unexpected. And I personally love that too. And it just depends on like what you're enjoying with it. Here I'd go, definitely the like grilled fish route. So I think the pairing that we put in here was the Mediterranean grilled sea bass. But like, doing this even with like tuna or like a more substantial fish, I think it could stand up to it. Just because it has this really amazing texture. And what's so interesting, I find here, is there's this great texture, but there's no oak whatsoever, all stainless steel. And then they're not using for both wines the process of malolactic fermentation, which sometimes you'll definitely find a lot of Chardonnays have that, which gives you that buttery texture. And so it's just amazing like that the YL or Uvlecchia has this great texture to it, just kind of naturally. And I would imagine that's from the Bianco Gentile, which is kind of beefing things up a little bit. And it could be too, the limestone soils too, which are like more prominent. It's just interesting how soils sense a place, and the addition of another grape can like really make a difference in two wines that are from the same vintage, which aren't like super far away from one another. So that's
Can
kind
you
of
just give maybe 5 seconds on the wine law again? Where are we on the pyramid here when we're drinking these two wines?
so the first wine. So you have like on your map here, it's coming from the A region, which is going to be Corsica Calvi, which is going to be in the northwestern corner. And then the Uvlecchia is coming where it says B on your Corsican wine map, which is Patrimonio is the like specific general region. But this is actually given the designation, their entry level wines, as Il de Beauté, because Patrimonio wines have to have very specific requirements in terms of like yields, in terms of the age of the vines, aging requirements. There's more that goes into that. And this is meant to be kind of a younger, like more youthful expression. Whereas Uvlecchia also does make a Patrimonio, Blanc, Rosé, and Rouge. But he puts this and declassifies it down to Il de Beauté, which is like a larger general classification, even though it comes from a smaller area, to kind of showcase that this is a more entry-level selection, if that makes sense.
It does. So if you're looking at the pyramid of Corsica, which I haven't looked up yet,
Yeah.
but I will, but what is there, like 3 or 4 levels of AOC?
So you have 9 subregions, 9 AOCs, and then you have the Il de Beauté, which is going to be under the IGP, Indication Geographique Protégée, entry level. You do have Vin de France wines too that they make in Corsica, your most entry level, but they're typically not made for consumption outside of Corsica.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
No props. And I'd say too, in terms of like what, people are most focused on in terms of like caliber and quality, in my opinion, definitely like once again, Patrimonio, and then Figari, which is going to be all the way down to the south, has some of the most prominent producers too. And then to the west too, kind of in the central west, Ajaccio as well. Definitely. Any questions before we move on to Rosé? We're feeling it. Yes, this is exciting. Okay. Well, rosé season is always upon us, in my opinion, but it's definitely upon us now. So we have here the 2019 Domena Marchigliani rosé, which is technically called the Rosé Gris de Marchigliani. And this is coming from the classification, if you look on the back, is called Vin de Corse, which is going to be the C on your map, but Vin de Corse kind of it kind of indicates that it's coming from the eastern side, the island, which isn't as well known for production. It's definitely a little bit more sparse in terms of what you're able to find, in a lot of farmland and a lot of kind of open space there. But as I mentioned, I personally, I'm a big lover of rosé, and I know that definitely over the last several years, there's a lot of rosés out in the market, and there's a lot of bad rosé out there, in my opinion. But there's also some really great rosé, and Corsican rosé is a real joy to be had, in my opinion. And this is one of my favorite Corsican rosé producers. I actually don't think that they bring anything else to the market in Massachusetts besides their rosé. While they do make other wines, it's very hard to find them. And they're actually most well known for their olive oil production. So as we were kind of talking through, how many cases a lot of these producers are making, we went down from 10,000 to 5,000, and now we have about 1,800 annual total production. So pretty small here. And they only have about 5 or so wines that they make in total. So this is actually coming from a little small town. You can actually see it, Agione, which is on the front here, which is only 245 inhabitants. And it is just west of the town, which I think is more coastal, called Aleria, which is the old Roman capital of Corsica. So this is going to be a rosé, which comes from 95% Ceccarello and then 5% Syrah. And it's started by the Almeric family, who started the winery in around the 1950s. And it's been passed down to the daughter of the family, Anne Almeric, who's taken over production, another female winemaker. And she replanted, she's, I think they're one of the first families to plant Syrah on the East Coast. You're finding a lot of Grenache and Syrah and kind of Rhone esque and Southern French grape varietals being planted throughout Corsica, since the Mediterranean climate really gives way to that. But what I love about this is it's just such a light expression and kind of showcases Ceccarello, which is known for being this high acid red grape varietal, thicker skin, but usually produces some lighter red wines when it's made into a red wine, but has been a favorite definitely for rosé wine production. And the Syrah here, just that hint of Syrah can give this wine a little backbone. So once again, a just quick refresher as to why this is rosé in color is you're taking the red grapes, pressing them, and then you're letting the juice soak with the skins for just usually a couple of hours to give out this color. So I would imagine they're not using a ton of time of maceration here, since it's just so light in color. So probably no more than 6 hours or so. And this is another stainless steel aged rosé. You'll almost find there's very few rosés that are ever aged in oak. I've had a couple expressions, and I must tell you, they're weird. But overall, it's a wine that's once again meant to represent freshness, kind of represent younger harvests. We're finding right now a lot of 2020 rosés are coming in, but there are several wines where I'm happy to drink, rosés that are a couple of years old. And definitely some of these Corsican producers, I think, can be really nice when you give them a couple years of age. So while this is a 2019 rosé, this can easily go for another year or so. And it's just such an incredibly fresh wine, but there's a little hint of power there too. It's a little more substantial than you might think when you just look at it. But it also just is so incredibly refreshing and just has this beautifully well-balanced finish. A little once again, briny, olivey, but also has some subtle kind of brambly red fruit as well. And I don't know about you, but I think this is just such a fun wine. I found this really cool dish, which is a Corsican chicken dish, which I thought this would go really nicely with. But once again, seafood, vegetarian options, there's so many choices here that could go well. And it has just that hint of rusticity, but it has that freshness, which I think is just so indicative of Corsican wine, in my opinion. So I'd love to hear your thoughts here. And I don't know if anybody's had Corsican rosé before, but what do you think? Any thoughts or questions, feelings?
I really like it. It's very refreshing. And I think that to your point about rosés that have come out recently that have been so, this definitely kind of resonates with me. And it reminds me, oddly enough, of an Austrian rosé that I really like.
Oh, yeah.
But it's obviously not the same region, but it reminds me a lot of that. So I'm excited to try more.
Which Austrian rosé?
The Gobelsberg.
I was just gonna say, I was like, I bet she's thinking the Goldfischberg. That's awesome.
That was my drink of last summer. It was so good, and so this reminded me a lot of it.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, you know, the Goldfischberg Rosé from Austria has just such a refreshing, uplifting characteristic for it. It's very energizing, and I think you find that here too. It's just like really refreshing, but there's something a little deeper here, which is really fun and just so food friendly and versatile. And
what's the grape? What's the grape in the Gogelsberg?
So Gogelsberg is Weigelt. It should be his Weigelt rosé, and I think that they blend maybe a couple other grapes in there too. I haven't checked as of recent, but it's very good.
We like this too. This was, I think, our favorite of the four.
Yeah.
You know, to your point, it was fresh and it was just a really delightful wine. And we don't drink a lot of rosé or white for that matter, but we really love this wine.
I'm so glad. That like makes me so happy. This is like literally like, you know, what I try to drink as much as possible whenever I can get it. In Marchigliani, I've just always been such a fan of what it is. They also do make a couple like, you know, red blends with like Syrah and Nieluccio and Ceccarello, but it's so hard to find them once again in the state. The availability is just so limited for some of these wines, especially with the fact that they have an overall 1,800 annual case production. So whenever I can get my hands on anything that they make, I always get very excited about it. So I'm glad that you enjoyed. And there, once again, are just so many great Corsican rosés, but I'd say like definitely the Marchigliani, and then Yves Leccia once again makes a rosé, which is beautiful. It has more texture, a little bit more like a little bit more fruit, like that's kind of like more in that kind of grapefruit strawberry category, but it's so refined and beautiful. And then Mastracci was making a rosé that came into the state. I'll have to check and see if they still are, which was like a little bit more savory, which was Nieluccio based. So there's a lot of really interesting ones to explore, and they're good quality. So I'm glad you enjoyed. Any questions before I move on to the last wine? We'll do it. Great. Awesome. So for our last one, we're going back to Domaine Mastracci, and we're enjoying the Clos Reginu, which once again is going to be that Corsica designation, but this is going to be like a single plot or single vineyard that they own. The grapes here are a blend of 4. So we have the Nieluccio, you have Ceccarello, you have Grenache, and Syrah. So 2 kind of well-known Corsican planted grapes, and then 2 coming originally from southern France, but definitely making their home in Corsica. You'll find that definitely a lot of the reds of Corsica tend to be more savory, more herbal. You'll find that the Ceccarello brings in that acidity. It's going to bring in kind of those herbal and like red fruit notes, whereas the Nieluccio is going to give you more robust tannic tendencies. It's a little bit more spicy, a little bit more gamey. And then Grenache kind of offers that like spicy red fruit. Syrah can also help with the tannin and gives you those really nice kind of combinations between dark fruit and some more savory characteristics. This is another stainless steel aged wine. So once again, no oak here today. So you can see kind of the natural expression. And we have the same soils here as what we had originally for the Mastracci. So we're going to be working with a lot of clay, sand, and granite here. This is fun. So I love the wines of the Rhone Valley and of southern France. So this definitely gives me those herbaceous and savory qualities, but there is still freshness here, which surprises me. I always am interested in kind of checking out the alcohol of this wine. This is 13%, which is like pretty well balanced. So it's interesting because Corsica, you kind of think of as a really warm area, especially with Sardinia being so warm, but there's more moderating influences that you find throughout the island. So you find some pretty well-balanced wines. I personally love to enjoy this wine with a little chill on it. I think that that's kind of what makes it stand out best and makes it pop. And this is once again, like a great wine to do with like summer grilling. but I also recommended it. There was a cool recipe that I found for, which is like a Corsican recipe for a mushroom like pate to do as like a little aperitif, which I thought could be kind of fun too. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on this wine and see what you guys think.
I liked it. I thought it was fruity, and it maybe nobody else felt this way, but it reminded me of a Beaujolais Nouveau.
Oh,
I
well,
thought it was
yeah,
I thought it was kind of light in that regard.
yeah, young wine. So I see what you're saying there. Like it's a youthful expression, maybe a little more earthy than Beaujolais Nouveau, but definitely with a little chill on it. It's, it's more playful. It's like youthful, but definitely with a little bit of a savory edge to it at the same time. This
I
is
like that. I like that comment because when I drink this, this isn't a Grand Cru or a Premier Cru. Okay, this is we have a tradition in our family where we start drinking wine early on Thanksgiving morning, and we'll open up Beaujolais. You know what I mean, at 10:30 while the turkey goes in or something like that. So this is this is a late afternoon red.
yeah,
Before dinner, before we get serious about drinking some Grand Cru or something like that. So I appreciate that comment, and I feel the same way. This is kind of very light and pleasant, but not too complex. And
source from
the
your
other thing about these wines I find difficult is I don't really know what's representative of Corsica. You know what I mean? I don't know. And that's what's so fun about this CruBox stuff is you're kind of drinking wines that or grapes that you don't really experience. How much Vermentino have you had before? Well, I guess Vermentino is a good one, but some of those other grapes,
yeah, for sure. It's
so
interesting to kind of get a sense of the island. And I think one of the best ways to summarize like my thoughts on the island is once again, you have the Mediterranean influence, but you have like, I feel like these wines are incredibly balanced for like where they're located. And there's some really interesting wines. Definitely the wines that we're experiencing tonight are definitely some of the more youthful expressions, but there are more serious expressions that take these up a notch. But what's interesting is at the same time, like the methods of production here, all these wineries are practicing organic or biodynamic. They're limited production. They're coming from a specific sense of place. And like they're these little family owned wineries. And that's just kind of what you find. Like the level of quality is really high. No matter if you're kind of getting something a little bit more playful, a little bit more kind of everyday, or if you're taking it up a notch too. I think the quality overall is really high, and the level of quality production is very high as well.
So quick question. The island is owned by the French.
Yes.
Does Corsica go by the French wine law? Do they have Premier Cru and Grand Cru on Corsica?
They don't. So they have definitely like, I'm sure that there's definitely single plots, like single vineyards from within Patrimonio or from within these more regarded like 9 subregions. But at this time, like, people don't understand, some like single vineyard plots within Patrimonio, even within like France, I would say. So they're not always like designating them, and they're not going for Grand Cru or Premier Cru status. They're just not there yet. That being said, there are like specific vineyard sites within Patrimonio or Ajaccio or Figari that are, well-regarded vineyards, which could be regarded as, the Premier Cru or Grand Cru of Corsica, but they just haven't gone through that process of designation yet. But there are like, what I think is cool at the end of the day is like, even if like, for example, the Yves Leccia was designated as Ile de Butte, which gives them more flexibility where they can source, but all of the land is within the Patrimonio area. So all these wineries are like, they own their own vineyards. They're coming from plots that you can like point out on a map. And I think that that's incredibly exciting. Also too, I'll say, so Kermit Lynch has a couple other really great Corsican producers. If you enjoy this and you want to explore more, my recommendation is if you want to kind of get into some of the more serious wines from Patrimonio, there's 2 producers in addition to Yves Leccia, which does make some great Patrimonio red, rosé, and white wines. There's another producer, it's a Kermit Lynch imported wine called Giacometti. Some of these sound French, some of these sound Italian. But they make some really beautiful wines from Patrimonio. And then Giudicelli is another really great Kermit Lynch producer, also from Patrimonio. So after this, if anybody's interested, just reach out to me. I'm super happy to kind of give you some more info about like things you should get into. And then the two other producers I'd say that Kermit Lynch are like has as a prize producers are Chloe Canarelli. Sometimes we get availability within Massachusetts, sometimes not, but I'm pretty close with our Kermit Lynch rep, so I can always check in. And Chloe Canarelli is in Figari, which is going to be all the way to the south and make some really interesting kind of unique wines. And then Comte Abatucci, which is in Ajaccio, which is in this kind of central west, is one of the original top producers of Corsica, and definitely something really interesting to explore if you want to kind of explore some of the top level wines. So I'd be happy to walk you through that. But this is just fun. It's like, for me, some of these areas are just so exciting and there's just so much to learn. And, you know, it's so fun to explore just some of these places that we're not all as familiar with, because there's just some great wines that come out of there. So I don't know if anybody had any thoughts or feedback, but we're just going to kind of continue really focusing on some of these really interesting topics in wine and interesting areas that we don't always get to explore as much. And we'll try to get more into detail. So
Yeah, this is just so much fun. This just makes me want to travel, right?
Yeah.
And we've all been cooped up for so long. But the other thing I thought was interesting was how we tasted some Sangiovese tonight.
Yeah.
And again, the island owned by France. Is there any Pinot Noir on the island?
Not
Or
knowledge, but there might be. I mean, I'm sure some producers are working with Pinot Noir. I also forgot to mention, I'll quickly make note of it right now. The interesting thing is I found out that Corsica was actually owned by Genoa, like the region or the area in Italy, for a long period of time until the 18th century. So those are those, like, you know, Italian roots, then taken over by France, and then Napoleon Bonaparte was born right about after that. So it became very French. But the interesting thing is, once again, people I think would refer to themselves as Corsican first and then French second, but Italy is like such a part of like the culture too. So it's just such an interesting place that's so unique. I'm going to call it out right now, but my dad and mom, my dad at the bottom, JJ Bell, got to visit Corsica several years ago, and just looking at their photos, it's definitely one of the places that I can't wait to visit, and I'm just like so excited for when that happens. So I'm sure he could give you some good recommendations for sure.
do tell, JJ, was it good?
Totally recommended. I mean, it's just it's not for everybody, because there's some rusticity to it that wouldn't satisfy everybody, but it's mountainous to the sea, and great food, great wine, a combination of Italy and France. What can be bad about that?
So cool. It's awesome, you know, and I think too, I will say, like, once people like start to travel again and everybody's feeling more comfortable in the world, a little bit of a safer place, like, please let me know if you choose to travel, you know, especially within Europe. Like, we have so many connections within Italy, France, Spain. And if I can ever help with like figuring out those itineraries for you, or giving some recommendations based on places I've been to or some of my colleagues have, that's always like such a fun part of working in wine for me, is like getting people to experience some of these places. Because once you go there, it all makes so much more sense, and it just like makes wine even more fun than it is already. So we'll get there. But in the meantime, everybody will be planning their itineraries for sure. But thank you so much, you guys. This was so much fun. And any questions you have, just please feel free to stay on with me. I'm happy to help in any way. And two, let me know if you're interested in learning any more about Corsican wine through any other wines that are available. I'm always happy to make the recommendations.
Where are we going next month?
I can't tell you. It's a surprise. I can't let everybody know. But we're going to go somewhere really fun. As
Take
always.
care, everybody. Thank you so much, Chelsea.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you guys have a good rest of the night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Thank you.